not going to win if you don't have the right information, according to former Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and rosing up doesn't help us be successful in this fight. And one retired intelligence officer, now on his 13th visit to the Supreme Court, has recently filed a petition for writ of certiorari, which may only be granted for compelling reasons. During what had become the longest respiratory tract infection pandemic in recorded history, only 13 cases had survived what is probably one of the most competitive processes in the world, more difficult than being the lucky recipient of a letter of acceptance at Harvard University. A grant of certiorari is indicative of that which is deemed most important to the nation, and, of 13 cases during the pandemic, only 3 were in reference to religious liberty, while 6 were related to elections. According to Sun Tzu, a contemporary of the lawgiver, Moses, it is only the enlightened ruler and the wise general who will use the highest intelligence of the army for purposes of spying, and thereby they achieve great results. And the general who wins a battle makes many calculations in his temple ere the battle is fought. Setting an early benchmark, former Deputy CIA Director Michael J. Morell had stated, conclusively, that, while COVID-19 would be with us for some time, perhaps 18 to 24 months, which had been the opinion of many medical experts, barring a breakthrough with either a vaccine or an antiviral. Yet, this worldwide emergency would not be terminated until May 2023.
Multiple trial courts throughout the global health crisis, during which, hands down, the U.S. had far outpaced the world in fatalities, finding Virginia beating Cuba, the military besting Zimbabwe and Texas, Florida and California each exceeding the death toll in China, where the pandemic had begun, had determined that this had been once-in-a-lifetime pandemic that had threatened irreparable harm to an unknown and unknowable number of people, and warranting that the scope of a court's review must be limited to a determination of whether the executive's actions were taken in good faith and whether there is some factual basis for the governor's decision that the restrictions he imposed were necessary to maintain order. Immaterial, apparently, to the trial courts, is the reality that this had only been the 5th pandemic after the 1918 flu pandemic, averaging out to a pandemic every 2 decades. A highly contagious disease is actually very rare in nature, requiring as little as 15 particles or less to infect any living host, and yet, although the procedure has been known to science since 1870, simply how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Roll Pop? That standard metric for assessment of transmissibility risk remains unknown. Yet this metric is a sine qua non-essential determination of correlates of protection, prerequisite knowledge to develop a safe and effective vaccine. Yet, in an actual possession under circumstances as to constitute reasonable notice to the owner, continuous and uninterrupted, open, notorious and visible, some leaders, even still today, have proudly boasted about victories in defense of the Commonwealth's COVID mitigation efforts. As Mankeet Louis, features editor for the BMJ Medical Journal, wrote last year, officially, the trail for definitive, scientific evidence is cold, which pundits claim is largely due to the Chinese government refusing to share data and cooperate with international investigations. According to Mankeet Louis, the consensus among scientists is that, although a lab leak origin is possible, the scientific evidence points to a natural, zoonotic origin from wild animals.
However, DoD defines terrorism as the unlawful use or threat of force or violence against people or property to coerce or intimidate governments or societies, often to achieve political, religious, or ideological objectives. A terrorist's activities do not conform to rules or laws of warfare. His ways are not our ways. His methods include use of NBC weapons, and so on. Most importantly, all warfare, even unconventional warfare, according to Sun Tzu, a contemporary of the lawgiver, Moses, is based on deception. Biological warfare is the oldest type of weapon of mass destruction, WMD, dating back to the Mongols in 1347, and the Assyrians in the 6th century BC. Victims, as even at the hands of a wrathful god in Egypt, are often non-combatants, symbolic persons and places, and political/military figures, and, often the victims, non-essential, and merely a means to an end, having no role in either causing or correcting a terrorist's grievance. They are merely, perhaps in God's will, victims of place and circumstance, at the wrong place at the wrong time. And, according to former HHS Secretary Alex Azar, on February 4, 2020, he had determined pursuant to his authority under Section 564 of the FDNC Act that there is a public health emergency that has a significant potential to affect national security or the health and security of United States citizens living abroad, and that involves a novel, new, coronavirus, nCoV, first detected in Wuhan City, Hubei Province, China in 2019, nCoV. The virus is now named SARS-CoV-2, which causes the illness COVID-19. On the basis of this determination, he also declared that circumstances exist justifying the authorization of emergency use of drugs and biological products during the COVID-19 pandemic, pursuant to Section 564 of the FDNC Act, subject to the terms of any authorization issued under that section.
Now, on petition for writ of certiorari, the court shall consider information presumed to be known to all leaders who had led the COVID-19 response. In condition precedent, before an EUA may be issued, the Secretary of HHS must, in ministerial obligation, declare that circumstances exist justifying the authorization based on one of 4 determinations. According to officially acknowledged sources, while the SecDef and DHS Secretary both hold an original classification authority, OCA, up to top secret, may issue an EUA, and particularly the DHS Secretary, who may render a determination with respect to a general domestic emergency in an overt act, they did not, at any time, ever exercise this discretionary authority. However, the HHS Secretary did act, upon his sole authority, limited expressly to threats to national security or the health and security of United States citizens living abroad, and that involves a CBRN agent or agents. The HHS Secretary, however, possesses OCA only up to secret. If those grounds are inadequate, a court may remand for the agency to offer a fuller explanation of the agency's reasoning at the time of the agency action. Moreover, this operative fact alone would arguably render any other use outside that scope an unauthorized commitment under the Federal Acquisition Regulations.
CBRN is what attorneys might describe as a term of art, and, at least, the late 1990s, when the Defense Intelligence Agency had established the AFMIC, a NORAD-type capability to detect and deter biological threats, in higher defense echelons, CBRN has been an umbrella term used by military to describe weapons, not infectious diseases. The U.S. Army has even established a school, USACPANS, at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, to codify the operations plan to enable the success of the USACPANS. Not the Medical Service Corps, but rather, USACPANS trains service members, develops leaders, develops doctrine, builds the future CBRN force, and is the joint combat developer for the Joint Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Defense Program. You may believe and you may have been told that COVID-19 is a highly contagious disease, but the controlling laws for the pandemic response paint an entirely different picture, which should be known to every member of Congress, because they had passed Section 564, the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act in 2006, in direct response to the terror attacks on September 11. Section 564 had been the authority for the emergency use authorizations to be issued in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Similarly, the Defense Production Act, which had been used 18 times, can only be used to address threats to the domestic production base, directly supporting defense-related missions and programs threatened not by disease but rather terrorist attacks. By December 2022, Over 98 million successful attacks had been reported in the US, resulting now in over 1.2 million deaths.
The matter now before the nation's highest court had been a simple document request presented by the person who had compelled the CDC during the Biden administration in a regulatory first to add both SARS-CoV and SARS-CoV to the select list of agents and toxins, identifying them both as chimeric viruses, which, by definition, can only find origin in a laboratory. Under law, that debate had been settled in the Code of Federal Regulations on November 17, 2021, after surviving 60 days of adverse comment. And ignorance of the law is not an excuse. With it established that the novel virus was a CBRN agent, or biological weapon, and a chimeric virus that can only find its proximate origin in a laboratory, with the now infamous OMB FOIA No. 21-220. A question had been here made as to the proprietary interests. Who owns the virus that had managed to beat Hitler in the Holocaust in half the time? This was, essentially, a common law action to quiet title to prove title, and yet, despite a court-acknowledged protracted history, there have been no reports at all in the press, even now, as this matter brings a case of first impression for the court. First, this matter raises whether the High Court should extend Bivens, a matter recently considered in Hernandez versus Mesa, which would require a novel circumstance. However, this would be the first case in which the Supreme Court shall directly a question squarely presented on the use of a GLOMAR response, in which the government has said that it can neither confirm nor deny. This case also presents issues arising under theories of disparate treatment and disparate impact, and it is no secret, even at the beginning, whether the novel virus had escaped from a lab or, as many believe, had naturally spilled over from nature. The elderly had been the hardest hit, representing most of the deaths to COVID-19. And yet not even one child or grandchild in the nation had taken steps to remove their loved ones while this genocide had occurred. In this matter, now before the Supreme Court, by email of March 23, 2021, OMB had acknowledged receipt of a request and assigned it tracking number 21-220 according to a sworn declaration from the Deputy General Counsel for the White House. OMB independently had interpreted plaintiff's request as seeking all OMB records pertaining to any determination that either the infectious dose or secondary attack rate of COVID-L9 or its corresponding virus, SARS-CoV. 2. Had warranted classification at the confidential. This designation that shall be applied to information, the unauthorized disclosure of which reasonably could be expected to cause damage to the national security that the original classification authority is able to identify or describe. You review the evidence, both direct and circumstantial, together with the reasonable inferences to be drawn therefrom, in the light most favorable to the government. Still, courts must ascertain whether, under the totality of the circumstances, conduct evinces a voluntary, knowing, and intelligent waiver. Any number of factors may be taken into account in deciding whether there is reasonable suspicion, and officers may consider the characteristics of the area in which they encounter suspicious activity. Agencies are only permitted to use a GLOMAR response when an acknowledgement or not of certain records would reveal the very information the agency seeks to protect. When using it to answer a FOIA request, in ministerial obligation, an agency must tether its GLOMAR response to at least one of the statutory FOIA exemptions. ID, citation omitted. On the record, I tell you that I discourage the practice in accordance with the NIS directive. Off the record, I tell you that it's an invaluable part of close infantry training, and if it happens to go on without my knowledge, so be it. One fictional commander had told an investigator. However, he, upon that occasion, had at least proffered the national security justification that he ate breakfast 80 yards away from 4,000 Cubans who are trained to kill me. We reviewed in novo a district court's grant of summary judgment in favor of an agency that invokes a FOIA exemption, which had not of record expressly occurred here, including when the agency has issued a GLOMAR response, and, indeed, agencies sometimes respond to FOIA requests by declaring that they can neither confirm nor deny the existence of records responsive to the request. However, agencies are only permitted to use a GLOMAR response when an acknowledgement or not of certain records would reveal the very information the agency seeks to protect. When using it to answer a FOIA request, in ministerial obligation, an agency must tether its GLOMAR response to at least one of the statutory FOIA exemptions, which, again, had not occurred here. However, a witness who makes a sweeping statement may open the door to use of otherwise inadmissible evidence of prior misconduct for the purpose of contradicting such testimony. Here, of record, he government had waived d. its right to file a response in this case, unless requested by the court, neither confirming nor denying the existence of the requested records. And no authorized exemption nor GLOMAR response was ever entered in the record. And for appellees, Heather V., Walsh had drafted a declaration based on personal knowledge, information, and belief as the Deputy General Counsel, attesting that she had been familiar with how the request submitted under the FOIA. That is the subject of this litigation, as handled by OMV, rendering testimony on the basis of decisions made during that process. The choice of a sworn declaration, rather than the usual government affidavit, is significant because the White House had known, from the outset, that the plaintiff had sought not just to enjoin the agency from unlawfully withholding documents, but had also expressly sought declaratory relief, which often goes hand in hand with injunctions. Yet, further, the Court of Appeals, in a FOIA case, insists, with no specificity so as to provide notice, that appellants' purely speculative claims about the existence and discoverability of other documents are insufficient to rebut the government's good faith showing. A reasonable trier of fact would conclude that the proffered explanation is unworthy of credence. Truly, nothing short of clairvoyance would have enabled anyone to anticipate that this court, or any court, would approve dismissal of this case. And now, not in televised debates in Congress, but in the quiet corridors of the nation's highest court, the justices must decide, in a matter against the White House, what will transpire next. The trial court had reported that the White House did and continues to refuse to reply in any manner to the request, asserting a presumptive claim of executive privilege. Since the Watergate scandal, that has been a signal to the courts to demand an explanation from the White House. However, of record, for unarticulated reasons that had never occurred, however, had that occurred, pharmaceutical companies would have been exposed to potential liability under a loophole in the PrEP Act, which had been enacted before the pandemic and amended 23 times during the crisis to preserve their veil of immunity. Plaintiffs may establish a government policy by showing that a decision-maker possess, ing, final authority to establish, policy with respect to the action issued an official statement of policy. To satisfy the threshold of an official acknowledgement, however, sufficient to defeat a GLOMAR response, the information requested must be as specific as the information previously released. It must match the information previously disclosed, and the information requested must already have been made public through an official and documented disclosure. Clearly, the specific information sought by the plaintiff must already be in the public domain by official disclosure. And yet the district court had refused to enjoin the agency from withholding agency records as required under the FOIA. There is a deafening silence about that which should be obvious, even in the record, as to why and astute observers are left to divine unspoken thoughts. Hence, this is potentially an unprecedented scandal at the highest levels of government, for most of the defendants had held major positions in the administration. Yet, further, the Court of Appeals, in a FOIA case, insists, with no specificity so as to provide notice, that appellants' purely speculative claims about the existence and discoverability of other documents are insufficient to rebut the government's good faith showing. A reasonable trier of fact would conclude that the proffered explanation is unworthy of credence. Truly, nothing short of clairvoyance would have enabled anyone to anticipate that this court, or any court, would approve dismissal of this case. And now, not in televised debates in Congress, but in the quiet corridors of the nation's highest court, The justices must decide, in a matter against the White House, what will transpire next. One simple inquiry became world famous, asking, what did the president know, and when did he know it? In the final analysis, the question boils down to this. If an agency is required to respond within 10 days, in the event that unusual circumstances arise, why didn't that occur? If an original classification authority at the White House, limited to the president himself, the National Security Advisor, and the DNI, in this instance, must be able to determine at the time whether and why information should be classified, citing at least a concise reason why, rather than within the statutory deadline of only 20 days, could not the White House respond to a simple question as to whether the infectious dose and/or secondary attack rate for COVID-19 was classified. Information? Why did that search require 9 months of planning, in coordination with the National Security Council, a 2-year search on email, warranting a confidential classification just for the search, and limited to classified emails at the confidential and secret level for a document that, more likely than not, if it exists, should be classified top secret/SCI and located in a restricted access safe, securely held inside a SCIF. Such a search would be reasonably expected to avoid locating the documents requested, and if those documents were classified, in addition to the topic of the request, then the government would have to own this biological weapon. The arguments on appeal are not fairly debatable under any reasonable construction of the record or the governing legal principles, and we have no reluctance in such circumstances. Most intriguingly, if a sworn declaration from the White House Deputy General Counsel, under penalty of perjury, has told the court that a search by OMB had begun on January 13, 2022, why did the counsel for the White House inform the requester on December 11, 2024 that they were only then at a position to begin to identify analysts to review what he had described as classified documents that have been sworn not to exist? They cannot have it both ways. The most famous sentence Howard Baker ever uttered was his immortal line about Watergate. What did the president know, and when did he know it? The inquiry ends there.
This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest.
It's Quaintance. Always.